Bernard de Montreal. Preparatory communication number 201. Electrical control of energy. The more human beings evolve towards a developed consciousness, the more they will be placed in a situation where they will need to achieve electrical control of energy. Electrical control of energy means that as man's consciousness evolves, his inner sensitivity will be altered to such an extent that a separation will be created between his so-called natural nature and his so-called supernatural nature. It is during the evolution of this supernatural nature, that is to say, of this extraordinary sensitivity, that he will perceive that the new man will be obliged to electrically control his energy. He will be obliged to electrically control his energy because life's events will easily create vibratory shocks within him. If these events are subject to the astral laws of interference, such that the new man will be forced, in the course of his evolution, to instantly transmute interference into a new inner force, which will gradually free him from all astral interference. What creates astral interference in man is the fact that his psychic energy, his universal energy, is not perfectly adjusted to his lower principles, such that his cellular consciousness does not respond perfectly to the powerful vibration of his universal energy. This condition can create great suffering in man, even acute suffering, which can remain with him for years until he has sufficiently evolved mentally to finally be able to take total control of this energy. And establish, between his subtle principles and his gross principles, a perfect harmony, which will free him from suffering, and finally allow him to live as he wants, as he must, and as is good for him. But the evolution of man towards this condition will not be easy, because man is a complex being, and man's inner laws can only be revealed to him through the perception of contact between psychic energy and his cellular consciousness. Man's cellular consciousness is extremely sensitive to any psychic impulse, which triggers an electrical impulse in him, activating his nervous system and eventually making him extremely vital. But to be able to bear this new vitality, which will initially be seen as a kind of suffering, man will have to learn to control his life perfectly. That is to say, to control events in his life perfectly. Until he has learned this, he will be subject to this electrification of his system, and he will one day have to create a sufficiently refined order of life for himself, so that he can no longer suffer from the contact between his psychic energy and his cellular consciousness. The electrical control of energy in the new man will fundamentally be a new kind of test for man's consciousness. It will represent the extreme peak of his development, and also the ultimate test of his mental consciousness over his emotional consciousness. When man has reached an advanced level of development of this electrical control of energy, he will begin to perceive that his life is under his control, and that there are fewer and fewer impediments to the creative manifestation of his life, as he conceives it. It is from this time onwards that man will begin to experience freedom, the joy of freedom, and the power to manifest himself in the world, on the material plane, in the way that suits him best. But awareness of this electrical control of energy won't be easy, because man is extremely polluted by the astral. That is to say, the astral forces within him, the animal forces, the lower forces, are extremely present. And the life forces that penetrate through this atmosphere have great difficulty adjusting to his cellular consciousness. So that man, in turn, has great difficulty in sensing the electrical control of his energy. And yet, this electrical control of energy is a natural part of human consciousness. But man has lost this awareness, and will have to regain it at another stage of evolution. To give a simple, graphic example of man's control of electrical energy and its necessity, to the extent that man is unable, on the material plane, to control the events of his life, and to bring life to bend to his will, on all levels of his experience, on all planes of his experience, there is in him a lack of electrical control of energy. When man will have reached a higher level of evolution, he will no longer feel the struggle between the forces of life manifested through events and his human consciousness, his will and intelligence. He will feel a perfect harmony, a very great presence on the material plane. But as long as he hasn't electrically controlled his energy, he won't be able to perceive the mental density of his consciousness. He will live his consciousness only on a purely egoic plane, instead of on a plane of great concentration, on a plane of great instantaneous intelligence, on the plane of a will perfectly adjusted to this intelligence. If the involutionary man has survived, if involutionary man has been a prisoner of survival for millennia, it's because he didn't have electrical control of his energy. Evolutionary man, on the other hand, will take life by the horns and bring it under his perfect control. He will no longer know the separation between his psyche and his being on the material plane. He will truly be a being perfectly united in his principles and perfectly capable of directing events on the material plane according to his own needs. He will no longer be subject to events. But the complexity of the human organism, on every level, means that man cannot easily move from permeability to impermeability. He cannot go from no centricity to great centricity from one day to the next. What's at stake is the very great and profound transformation of his centers, and his ability to develop a greater awareness of his own being, a greater realization that it is he, in the end, who must dominate life's events. And this is inconceivable for the involutionary human being, because the involutionary human being is a being who undergoes life. Whereas for the new man, this conception of life will be totally outdated, so that this being, this new type of evolution, will transform his way of living, insofar as he will be able to control his energy electrically. It's not a matter of man understanding the inner aspects of this electrically composed energy. It's a question of man realizing the fundamental principles of his consciousness, and finally achieving electrical control of this energy. And one of the great fundamental principles of man's consciousness is this: every man evolving in consciousness, every man evolving in will and intelligence, must one day come to realize that the totality of his consciousness must be under the control of his earthly principles, and not under the control of the extrasensory principles that come from the higher ethers of his psychic organization. In other words, man's energy must be totally under his control, and never again under the control of the occult forces that are part of the internal organization of his ego. Man is a being who doesn't know himself. And the reason he doesn't know himself is simple: he has never brought himself to test his power. He has always lived according to what life brought him, but never according to what he could create in life. And because of this, over the millennia, man has become a lazy being. A being who has constantly disengaged himself from his consciousness, which alone is perfectly capable of electrifying his cells and giving his mind power over events, and eventually, power over matter. Man is a being who thinks in terms of the possibilities he has recognized in the course of his experience. But he doesn't know that the possibilities he has known in the course of his experience are only commensurate with his involutive faculty, whereas his faculties must be commensurate with his evolutionary potential. That is to say, its voluntary potential. This potential will eventually lead him to electrically control his energy, and to draw from the vast reserve of his science and consciousness the tools needed to constantly transmute his principles and give his life an increasingly supernatural allure. The evolution of supramental consciousness on Earth is not simply a philosophical evolution. It is also an electrical evolution, an organizational evolution on the psychic level. Man must one day come to feel within himself the totality and unity of his consciousness, the unity of his power and the unity of his action. He cannot be indefinitely separated, divided, and fragmented into potentialities. He must himself become a perfectly unified potential. That is, an embodied creative capacity. A creative capacity capable of withstanding the shock. The pulsation of psychic energy, perfectly harmonized with his human electrical potential. The electrical control of energy is, and will be tomorrow, the most important aspect of man's consciousness, and the most vital aspect of his cellular consciousness. It is from this control that man will pass from involution to evolution. It is from this control that man will realize what human nature means. And it is also from this control that he will discover the difference between a human being and being a man. The phenomenon of man is an evolving one, and man's psychological condition, which makes him vibrate on all levels of his being, will evolve with time. And with time man will discover that the vibratory resonance within him must be perfect, so that what he knows, what he thinks, what he wants, must tomorrow become the absolute expression of what he can, so that man's will and man's power will become one. But this will only happen to the extent that man has taken electrical control of his energy. The events that are created in life are created according to his astral consciousness. That is to say, man's involutive consciousness is programmed. Insofar as man needs to live a certain programming for the planetary manifestation of his consciousness. When man has evolved beyond this condition, he will no longer be subject to planetary programming, so that his electrical potential will be immensely increased, and man's consciousness will be proportionally immensely refined. It is at this point that man will feel within himself a great distance from the human being of involution. It is from this moment onwards that he will recognize, within himself, a certain state of perfection or a certain state of perfectioning, which will be the result of his profound understanding of the laws of man, the laws of life and the laws of events. Just as the human being was subjected to events during involution, so the new man, the real man, the integral man, will be above the events of involution. And it's for this reason that the new man will be a being perfectly at ease with himself. That is, a being perfectly balanced on the psychic level. Because, electrically, he will be perfectly coordinated. His cellular consciousness will respond perfectly to the totality of his consciousness. And man will no longer feel within himself the kind of failure which is a natural part of the psychological makeup of the involutive self. What prevents man from electrically controlling his energy is his subtle inability to feel his own power. Man lets his power slip through his fingers. He doesn't give himself the chance to take that power and exercise it. Because there are subjective, emotional mechanisms within him that make him a passive being. A being capable of being dominated, instead of a being capable of dominating. And man must dominate his life situation. He must always be the dominant factor in the coexistence of the invisible with the material. There must be no space in man's life for the manifested psychic presence of the invisible. The invisible and the material must be perfectly harmonized, perfectly unified, so that man can be born, and the human being dies, so that evolution begins and involution ends. For this to happen, man must become aware of his potential. He must realize that there is basically no limit to his expression, no limit to his will, that there is no impotence within him, that the only form of impotence arises from self-doubt. And as long as man has or experiences self-doubt, at whatever level of his consciousness, he will not be able to perfectly control the energy of his psychic consciousness. Thus, he will become more and more occult in his consciousness. But he won't be able to materialize the occult of his consciousness. That is to say that he won't be able to put an end to the division of the invisible and the material within him. So he will remain too long subjected to the occult forces of his involutive consciousness. He won't be able to feel the perfection of his will. And man must feel the perfection of his will, because it is in this deep, internal sense of himself that he will feel the reality of his consciousness. To say that man has no mental limits is one thing. To understand it is another. To realize it is yet another. The new man will inevitably realize that there are no mental limits to his consciousness. This means that the human being who passes from the involutive stage to the new stage, making of himself a new being, a real man, will have the capacity to intervene precisely in the psychological organization of his life. So that it will be possible for him, in time, to conclude that life is not simply a programmed manifestation of events but effectively a breakthrough of his will, through the astral layers of his consciousness, leading inevitably to the real, absolute, cosmic confrontation of his will with the double. That is to say, this source of energy which descends towards man, which fuses with him, but which can only be perfectly absorbed into him once he has learned to control its energy electrically. The double represents only one facet of man's energy. The double represents only one facet of man's psychic reality. It represents only one facet of man's morontial reality. With evolution, the double, in its presence, will constantly transform itself, and the day will come when man will no longer speak of his double, but only of the power of his energy. And the further man evolves, the more his mind will be able to bear the vibratory distance that exists between the consciousness of his cells and the origin of the vibration, so that eventually man will feel in his mind the infinity of his consciousness. He will no longer need a psychological relationship with the double. He will live solely on the psychic support of the double and, on the egoic level, he will finally become liberated from this occult presence within him, which in one sense has helped him towards evolution, and in another sense has created within him a terrain of suffering, necessary for the integration of energy. But man can't suffer the energy of the double indefinitely. Which is why one day he'll have to come to electrically control this energy. And it's through the control of events that he'll come to do this. It is through his ability to create a new, perfectly developed order for himself, that he will come to see through the vibratory play of his consciousness, and that he will inevitably be able to control the energy of this consciousness, so that he himself, as a being, can feel that he is truly man and no longer simply a human being, subject on a planetary scale to a consciousness that is not perfectly developed. The electrical control of energy will manifest itself to the extent that man's mental awareness is equal to his will. This means that insofar as the man of the future will be capable of voluntarily bearing what he knows, and this measure will not be easy to acquire because it is proportional to his capacity to destroy within himself the slightest doubt that may exist regarding his capacity for consciousness to manifest himself integrally. That is to say, to manifest himself as he wishes. The more man will be able to manifest his consciousness as he wishes, the more he will be able to electrically control his energy, the more he will enter the spirit of the cells. The more he will have access to an infinite range of knowledge, and therefore an infinite range of possibilities, to open up, on the material plane, a field of experience that will coincide perfectly with the balance of his principles. But until he understands the perfect relationship between his power and the actualization of his energy, he won't be able to concretely verify the creative expression of his ego and the creative capacity of his will. He will always remain a human being and will not yet be a man. Man, in the cosmic definition of evolution, represents a being who has transmuted the power of the invisible and given himself on the material plane, the plane where he is, the total ability to integrate invisible energy into a mental and intelligent constant, which is part of the psychic organization of his natural self. That is to say, his gifted self. His self raised to a level of consciousness capable of giving man the noble nature of a higher consciousness. A consciousness no longer subjected to the laws of involution or the laws of death. It is at the level of the electrical control of his energy that man will come to be able to give his human consciousness the full definition of its natural character. That is to say, its capacity to create, on the human plane, with the total freedom of a mind perfected to the level of its origin. That is to say, to the level of its energy, without astral coloration. When the human being disappears, man grows. When powerlessness disappears, power grows. When false will disappears, great and real will appears in man's life. And we finally have a product or model of evolution that is no longer part of the planetary archives of involution, but part of the power, the creative power of the new evolution, to which man is attached, to which or towards which he is related and through which he is powerfully energized. The new man will be a model of evolution, not simply an experimental model of consciousness. And when we say that he will be a model of evolution, it is he himself who will create his own model of energy actualization on the material plane. And this model will be built insofar as he, as man, is able to withstand the vibration, and to electrify his consciousness perfectly, so that the events of his life coincide perfectly with what he wants, and not simply with what he has to live through, to arrive at some experience. The new man will no longer live from experience, but simply from the manifestation of his energy. He will be the categorical and absolute expression of the new human mental volition, in perfect and harmonious relationship with the cosmic forces underlying the psychic organization of the ego, and which will give the new man a new universal constant. That is a new universal consciousness. It is in this universal constant that man will discover the absolute of the cellular mind. It is in this universal consciousness that the psychological reflection of the ego will no longer be necessary to give man the permanence of his consciousness. It is in this universal constant that man will discover that he is, indeed, a being appointed by energy and not simply a being appointed by occult forces, which constantly circumvent his reality, in order to one day achieve fusion with his mortality. The human being must be the perfect expression of the descent of energy into matter. It cannot simply be the imperfect expression of cohabitation. He cannot simply be the expression of juxtaposition. It must become, over time, the total and perfect expression of an absolute whose primordial quality, on the material plane, is to create according to the perfect harmony of its principles, and not simply to constantly undergo an event, due to a mental inability to control its energy electrically. Man's will, man's real will, is a potential for affirmation, so it's a potential for control. So it's from man's will that the electrical control of his consciousness will take place. And this will not come overnight, because it's part of the actualization on the material plane of a new life potential. That is to say, a new mentation, a psyche perfectly adjusted to the materiality, the mortality of man. For man to eventually come to know that he is perfectly balanced in his centers, he must eventually come to realize and know that he is capable of perfectly achieving what he wants. And as long as man doesn't know that he's capable of perfectly achieving what he wants, he won't be able to take control of his electrical energy. Because there will still be a certain amount of space within him, a certain amount of doubt about his ability. And man must not doubt his ability, because this doubt is part of the astral consciousness of his involution. It is through the control of his mental energy that man will eventually come to electrically control his energy, for his mental energy is the most powerful. It dominates his consciousness and makes him a submissive or powerful being. Man's mind is part of the inner nature of his ego. It is also part of the close relationship between the human plane of consciousness and the astral plane or cosmic plane of consciousness. Eventually, man will have to eliminate from his mental consciousness any personal form of energy we call subjective thought, the personal form of mental energy. That is so say subjective thought colors human consciousness. That is to say what it astralizes him and robs man of the creative will of his own electric power. It's in the nature of subjective thought to rob man of the creative will of his energy. This is why subjective thought will be increasingly transmuted in the course of evolution, so that man will one day no longer feel, on the mental plane, a psychological presence or psychic presence. That is to say a purely subjective way of thinking or higher mental control from a cosmic double. But this will come insofar as man is able to electrically control his energy, because in the course of this evolution, as he comes to do this, man will realize that he dominates all the principles that build or underlie his consciousness. And he dominates his principles insofar as he is capable, as a being, of supporting the emptiness of his consciousness and at the same time bringing out, on the material plane, the fullness of that same consciousness. Man will endure the emptiness of his consciousness by depersonalizing his mind, and he will make the fullness of his consciousness appear on the material plane, by electrically manifesting his energy, by electrically controlling this same energy, so as to be able to attract to himself the events necessary for the harmonious construction of his life. The human being is an instantaneously evolving phenomenon. He represents the absolute quality of energy to manifest itself absolutely instantaneously. And as man moves from involution to evolution, this quality of human consciousness will become more and more manifest, and man will discover that the nature of his being lies not in his ultimate occult relationship with the infinite, but in his ultimate infinite capacity to depersonalize the occult, and to create on the material plane. A close relationship between the movement of energy and his will. In this time to come, man will realize that the unity of his consciousness, the reality of his consciousness, has nothing to do with the subjective quality of his thinking, in the face of the occult or invisible of his consciousness. This is only a subtle shimmering of the mental plane, serving to give man an egoic consciousness, but inevitably doomed to be transmuted by man himself. Because it is man himself who will ultimately become the final product of the movement of cosmic energy towards the material plane. It is man himself who will inevitably become the absolute and constant factor of energy from the highest to the lowest planes. It is man himself who will eventually represent, in the cosmos, the unity of what is known as cosmic energy. During involution, man had to endure this energy, because during involution his mind was not trained to the total manipulation, through the ultimately human will, of energy. But in the course of evolution, man will come to be able to perfectly use this energy, to perfectly give it the form that will coincide with his needs. And it's in this time, in this future, that we'll discover, on the material plane, an effectively sublime being, a noble being, a real being, who will no longer live in psychic alliances with an invisibility or planes that have, from time immemorial, dominated his evolution. We will discover a real being who has finally broken with the psychological polarity of the ego, who has finally broken with the emotional device of involutive consciousness, to finally attribute all possible power to himself, according to his capacity to bear the energy. And insofar as man is capable of attributing all possible powers to himself as a function of his evolution, we will discover an increasingly advanced man, in all fields of energy expression. So we'll discover a man finally able to assume the planetary and cosmic responsibility of evolution, without having to think, without having to go back, and without having to be put on trial in relation to cosmic values or in relation to inner or spiritual or metaphysical values that are part of the play of the astral mind on his human consciousness. Still unprepared for the total immersion of the self in the total conversion of energy. So, electrical energy control is part of man's new evolution. It will bring man to a greater and greater realization of his absoluteness and enable man to finally identify perfectly with himself. And when man is able to identify perfectly with himself, he will become increasingly capable of assuming total responsibility for his actions, on a material level. He will no longer have to question. That is to say, to experience the doubt of the psychological management of his ego. He will be a perfect being. He will be a perfectly integrated being, and he will indeed give birth to the integral man. That is to say, to that man that the ancients have always idealized and agreed is the highest manifestation of consciousness. That is to say, the Christman, the ultimate man, the perfect man. But we have to be careful, because even today, man is not sufficiently integral to be able to really understand what the Christman means, because man tends to use words and forms according to the memory of the past, according to the emotionality he has put into this memory, to ascertain some form of ideal and evolution. Christ man, universal man, conscious man, new man, integral man, all these terms refer to just one of man's realities. The one in which he will one day finally be able to electrically control his energy. That is to say, to bring to himself all that is good, all that is great, all that is well, all that is perfect, and to push away from himself all that retards his own evolution, all that prevents his equilibrium, all that inevitably leads him to suffering and ultimately to death. The function of world education is to project the future definition of man into the future. Its function is to describe something of what the new man will be. It is inevitably impossible for the man of today to fully understand what the new man means. Even instruction cannot make it clear, because the new man will only be when he himself will be. But instruction can easily explain, shed light on and reveal the contours of this man, so that involutive man, moving from involution to evolution, can gradually perfect his nature, perfect his relationship with his inner self, understand the mechanics of his inner self, and one day be perfectly free, on the level of energy, of the movement of this energy through his principles. It is then that man will electrically control his energy and no longer be part of the involutive human race.